Nando's explained to their customers that they can't get a free refill of Coke because it's been banned by the government. These are all, in fact, Tory policies that are carried over from the previous government.
The state should be our servant, not our master. These are democratic decisions, not devolved to some quango.
I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent group of leading thinkers, speakers, politicians in this area. To my left, politically maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll find out. Otherwise, is Charlie Dewhirst, who's one of the bright sparks of the new 2024 intake of Tory MPs and the Member of Parliament for Bridlington and The Wolds. To my right, Andrew Griffith, Shadow Secretary of State for Business, and one of the greatest voices for pro-enterprise policy, we think, of the Conservative Party. Is that fair to say? Is that fair to say?
Thank you.
And on my furthest right, certainly politically, is Christopher Snowdon, who is our Head of Lifestyle Economics at the REA, expert in all things lifestyle regulation and general scourge of the nanny state. Chris, I'd like you to start with your sort of opening remarks, if you could, and then we'll work our way down the panel.
Thanks, Callum, and thank you all for being here. This is very strange speaking like this, but hope you're all right with it. So we've had a Labour government now for a little bit over a year, and already we're seeing the kind of big state interference, nanny state meddling, and petty prohibitionism that we expect with socialist parties. We've had a ban on disposable vapes in June. We got the Online Safety Act now is in full force. There was much hilarity on Twitter last week when a sign from Nando's, in which Nando's explained to their customers that they can't get a free refill of Coke because it's been banned by the government. We've got a football regulator. We've got the Pet Abduction Act, stopping people coaxing cats down the street. We've got a ban on the advertising of tasty food coming in January. We've got a vape tax coming in this time next year. And, of course, the generational tobacco ban. Now, of course, as most of you will have twigged, these are all, in fact, Tory policies that are carried over from the previous government. My case to you is that I don't think many people join the Conservative Party in order to stop people selling 3 cakes for a tenner. I think these kind of policies are more or less forced on politicians, and they don't have the backbone to resist them. I've got a book about this actually coming out next year, looking at several nanny state measures that were introduced under the last government. And in every case, the policy was not in a manifesto. It didn't seem to be particularly dear to the heart of the Prime Minister or anybody in the cabinet. They were, the government was essentially bounced into them by pressure groups who, funnily enough, tend to be very good at applying pressure. And if the issue is relatively low salience to the politicians, which most nanny state policies are, then they tend to just weigh up the political costs and benefits of acting or not acting. And they conclude, unless there's significant public opposition, that it's better just to capitulate to these people and get these activists off their back for 5 minutes, at least. I'm going to give some practical advice. I'm assuming here that certainly on the panel and hopefully in the audience, we have Conservatives who are against the nanny state. If not, then we can discuss that later. But assuming that to be the case, I think there are a number of things actually the next Conservative government could do to prevent being bounced into these kind of policies. I have a 6-point plan, in fact. The first is don't open a public consultation unless you're absolutely committed to the policy. Now, generally speaking, public consultations are only launched when politicians are committed to policy. But occasionally, as with some of the policies I'm talking about, and I'm talking about things in the area of alcohol, gambling, vaping, smoking, and food, sometimes governments have been known to launch a consultation just to try and push this issue into the long grass for a little bit while they think about it, get some of that pressure off them. The problem is that once you open a consultation, then the activist groups start implying that the government is committed to this idea. They get the bit in their teeth, assuming that they can sense blood, and if the government then decides against doing it, even if the consultation has broadly given a negative response, they will be accused, the government, of kowtowing, capitulating, caving in to whichever industry is supposed to benefit from the policy not being introduced. So don't do that. Number 2, abolish civil servants who are working on policy development. There is, for example, as far as I'm aware, a policy lead on gambling and alcohol at the Department of Health, whose previous job was the policy campaigns manager for an anti-alcohol pressure group. I don't think the Department of Health should have policy leads as such. And indeed, the Department of Health shouldn't really be getting involved with policies on these things anyway. Gambling is within DCMS and alcohol policy is within the Home Office. But there are dozens, if not hundreds, of people working within either OID or the Department of Health who are only working on developing policy and trying to create support for those policies. The policies should come from politicians, or better still, think tanks. They shouldn't be coming from civil servants who have nothing else to do. The civil servants should be running the NHS and nothing more at the Department of Health. Number 3, ban state funding of pressure groups. The one I mentioned before with relation to alcohol is state funded. About 10 years ago, the government did clamp down on this to some extent, at the Westminster level at least. It's still very prevalent in the devolved administrations and even in local councils. Local councils have, they've had their budgets cut enormously over the last decade, and yet they still managed to find money to give to various so-called public health lobby groups. That should just be banned. Fourthly, don't let socialists and progressives into the Conservative Party. And if you do, don't let them become MPs. And if somehow they accidentally become MPs, certainly do not make them ministers of public health. The Conservative Party is a broad church, but does it really need to be so broad that it allows in people like Rory Stewart and Sarah Wollaston? I would argue probably not. And these are the people who, not having any conservative principles at all, tend to go along with nanny states policies. Number 5, abolish the public health minister post. This is a post created by Tony Blair in 1998, I think. It serves no real purpose other than to put usually a quite inexperienced MP into a role where they immediately go native because they're immediately the target of a whole load of pressure groups who urge them to make a name for themselves by being a world leader in alcohol control or tobacco control or whatever it may be. They find that irresistible. It's a great name to get their name in the newspapers, and they don't actually do anything for public health. When there is an actual public health emergency, they don't really do anything. The Department of Health takes on, as we saw during the pandemic. Raise your hand if you can remember who was the Minister for Public Health during the pandemic. Anyone at all? Anyone know? It was Jo Churchill. She was in the role for more than 2 years, but completely sidelined by Matt Hancock and the Department of Health because there was actually something serious to deal with. I often think that Anna Soubry's decline from being a relatively feisty right-winger to being whatever she is now was due to her becoming Minister for Public Health at one point. We don't need a Minister for Public Health. We have the Health Security Agency. We have the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities for everything else. Number 6, finally, abolish the Office for Health and Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. Apparently, it was originally going to be called Health Inequalities, but they thought the disparities sounded more modern. This is just Public Health England rebranded. Public Health England was supposed to be closed down because it was so inept, particularly with the pandemic, but also many other things. It was supposed to be replaced by the Health Security Agency, which only looks at genuine public health issues, by which I mean environmental pollution, contagious diseases, and so forth. But the government was unable to stop public health springing up in a new guise, and all it does is push for various nanny state policies. So, in conclusion, if you are indeed committed to personal liberty, to business indeed, and resist and rather resent and look back over the 14 years rather confused that the government often ended up doing the exact opposite of the reason people, I think, mostly join the Conservative Party. That is a plan for stopping it happening again.
Chris, thank you. It sounds like a pretty robust manifesto for liberty that I'm sure our shadow bench representative is now going to fully endorse. Andrew?
I fully endorse this effort. Yeah, look, I mean, everything Chris says and some, to be honest. I won't repeat it in the way of too many panels. you could take that in a couple of other directions. First of all, if you have fewer civil servants, fewer public health officials, they will, by necessity, have to make different choices. Secondly, if you hold people to tighter accountabilities, it's always much more fun and much more interesting to go on a campaign to campaign against a particular form of behaviour than it is to do your day job, if your day job is managing waiting lists and getting it down. So you can see the attraction of going to endless meetings all across the country to talk about obesity or sugary foods or the iniquities of television adverts or whatever. That feels like a nice life. But if you tie people closely to a KPI, there's less scope to do that. I completely agree with the problem being Conservative candidates and members of Parliament who don't understand what individual liberty is, who've never been forced to confront that. They've never read Hayek. They don't read the IEA pamphlet, Your Great Work. They've been often, and one of the challenges is often the outreach efforts. The people that will sort of find you, and this is true in any walk of life, if people have to make an effort to find you, find your role, that is one thing. But if you go casting a net out wide, saying simply be a candidate with no particular process and no evidence of their ideology or having been tested by fire, then you will get people of a soggy disposition who are very vulnerable to having their minds influenced by this idea. But you can't excuse that when that's the Prime Minister of the country. I mean, that's not some backbench, junior parliamentary underspokesman. It's the Prime Minister of the country deciding that he wanted his legacy to be enacting the most draconian form of generational ban that any country on earth has adopted. So you have to look a little bit deeper about some of those things. We could take a lesson out of the left's campaign rule book and seek to get people like Charlie and myself to sign pledges promising never to curtail the individual liberty of people, never to enact restrictions on freedom of choice, to ban advertising, to ban things per se. So I think we could embellish your 6-point plan and just give that somewhat greater effect. But it is, of course, an enormous regret to have ever been part of a government that's done any of the things you talked about. I reversed in number 10 when I was for a period of time the policy director. I reversed the HFSS ban. I stopped it, and then of course it came back, like the Terminator, where you've broken the robots into all the little pieces of mercury, and they recompose and reassemble, and before you know it, you're back into the world of an HSS ban, and it's not a fair fight, because whereas we are on the outside, making these arguments, of course there are agents within. The Chief Scientific Officer Network in many of these things is aiding and abetting pushing these prohibition behaviours. I mean, people like Patrick Vallance, now a Labour minister, if you ever had to work out where his affiliations may have always been, but at that point, a highly paid independent civil service offering advice to the government. So choose your advisors carefully would be a point as well. And look, just finally, that's more about what we could do. I mean, we could expand the scope all day long, because you've chosen here a number of sort of prohibition things about what we put into our bodies and what we may as consenting adults see television adverts for. Of course, the encroachment of the state into the area of private contract, if you look at renters' rights, the attack on second homeowners, so that two people with exactly the same investment in a property, one happens to have one big one, the other has, for all sorts of reasons, they may have caring responsibilities, be digital nomads, has two smaller ones, has a very different treatment in the tax system. That's another way in which the state is interfering with individual freedom of choice. And we could go on for so long that poor Charlie would never get a word in edgeways. So I will leave it there. But that's a very good, the 6-point plan seems to me a very good initiative. And above all, make sure your Conservatives are conservative.
Exactly that. And I think that which we'll come on to discuss later, but the focus of today's panel discussion is paternalism and maybe nanny statism, but that certainly does, it's the lack of, it seems to be that the lack of liberty-minded people in the party and maybe in the country which underlines the paternalism, the rise in paternalism, also underlines the rise in the state and the size of the state in general, which I think leads us on to Charlie and your initial gambit.
Thanks, Callum. I don't mean to disappoint, but if anyone was hoping for the pro-nanny state view on the panel today, I'm not going to be the one to give it. Look, I think one of the clearest signs of how we lost our way in the last government was the Conservative Party's failure to continue its core support of the individual. We were buffeted by events. Even going back to Cameron, his first job was to sort out the financial crash, 2008. We then had COVID. We had Ukraine. We never really pulled back from what Tony Blair had started, which was that hugely regulatory overreach, the bigger states and everything else. And then, of course, as things were becoming increasingly challenging for us, we did, as Chris sort of referred to, we would adopt ideas that were simple and, sounded good. So let's ban plastic straws, right? Which means I can no longer have a McDonald's milkshake, because it'll just disintegrate before I get to the end of it. I will have a battle with a bottle of water every time to get the top off it because it's attached. All of these things which seem nice to do, but actually were just, as you say, part of the public health lobby, things that really, frankly, were a mess. And my own sort of personal working experience the last few years working in the farming industry was the way in which DEFRA in particular would meddle with ministers, the way in which there was a sort of loss of control. Of course, like all departments, they have some powerful quangos, some arms-length bodies, Environment Agency, Natural England. One particular policy area around labelling was very fascinating. We had a 2-year consultation, a battle against this. It was a very, very unpopular idea. It united on a very, very rare occasion both the retailers and the farmers. Everyone was against this idea. And the farming minister, Mark Spencer, kiboshed it, said, no, we're not doing it. It's not happening. There was a reshuffle. Mark remained in place, but the Secretary of State changed. Day one, the civil servant responsible for that policy got to the Secretary of State and said, we have an oven-ready policy, ready to go. The Secretary of State announces it and says, we're going to do this. And poor old Minister Spencer, completely blindsided, was running around panicking. What the hell is going on? And this is that influence of civil servants who are not doing as they should be as servants to the ministers, the politically elected body, are interfering. And then you've got, in terms of the food production side of it, the way in which arms-length bodies are just telling farmers what to do. Natural England will tell you when you can spread manure, thinking that they've got a better idea than the farmers do. We have a bunch of civil servants creating policy in food production who've never been on a farm. They certainly have no concept of the complexities of what it's like to grow crops or to rear livestock. It is extremely concerning the way in the direction of travel. Now, I will defend, the last government to a point, but I think because of the fact we didn't get a grip on it and we didn't haul it back and we didn't say, look, the football regulator, come on, guys. I mean, I know it sounds nice to a bunch of, football fans when their club's gone bust and you say, look, if only we had a regulator, it would have been fine, to your Bury fans or whoever it might be. It wouldn't have made any difference. That club would still have gone bust. You're basically just creating something which I suspect will happen is the new regulator comes in, does a couple of nice things to sort out a couple of small issues, and then, of course, the overreach begins. And yet again, we'll see how that happens. We see it across the state, where you create a body, well-intentioned, it's there to do a good job, but of course, they need to prove their worth, don't they, as civil servants, as arms-length bodies, which is why they interfere, they overreach, and more. So I hope, and I certainly think under the current leadership and with people like Andrew in the Shadow Cabinet, there's very much an understanding that we need to row back on this. We need to remind people why we are Conservatives and why Conservatives is the only option for this country, the only option for the future of this country. So I'm confident that we can rewind the past, get back to our core principles and present the only sensible option going into the next election.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Charlie. And I think I want to, Andrew, turn to you in the first instance as the big part of the Shadow Cabinet and the leadership of the Conservative Party, because what we have on our hands here, we're all agreeing, violent agreement about lots of this stuff, right? But it won't. There's probably a reason why Chris, when he opened his remarks, said all this stuff happens because basically nobody has enough backbone to really push back against it. And it all sounds, as Charlie mentioned, it all sounds politically feasible. We don't want bottles being separated from their caps and screwing up recycling or whatever. So there's the political incentives for this aren't quite to the pro-liberty direction, are they? Do you think there's a way in which the Conservative Party can win a majority again by being the really pro-individual party, by winning it? Does Chris's 6-point plan win a majority in Parliament? Does being that radical in favour of the individual, is that a path to victory?
Yes and no, right? I mean, I've been a district member of parliament for nearly 6 years. I can promise you not once on all the doorsteps I knock on, and I knock on a lot of doorsteps and talk to a lot of people, has any ordinary human being said, the thing I want to know from you as my member of parliament is what you're going to do about high-fat yoghurt, right? No, nada. No one's actually ever had a real conversation with me about smoking ban. No one's actually ever really said, this is something that, even though it's a bit more salient, this is something that I feel important about. So I'm not sure if I'm truth. We're going to win a enormous crushing victory with Charlie and I positioning ourselves at the head of an army of freedom-loving Brits. But equally, nor do I think there's a electoral penalty from not doing any of these things. I think there's an issue about how things are always framed. If you think about the debate about most of these things, that the BBC might run, they would have a right of centre politician, a left of centre politician, and then an expert who's independent, often not as independent as one might want, often from the blobocracy, but someone who instinctively starts from a position of believing in the moral virtues of more legislation. And so there's a piece about the framing, and the IEA and Reams was here earlier. I mean, Reams blooming a one-woman army who's actually out on the airwaves offering the counterfactual. I'm sorry, I'm sure you are as well, Chris. I learned. I'm not just burnishing my old credentials. I learned about what it means to have economic and individual liberty from the IEA reprints of F.A. Hayek. Going to the alternative bookshop at the LSE in London and buying little blueprints and occasionally picking up Libertarian Alliance pamphlets alongside the IEA. I'm that old. I don't think that is a common experience of most current members of Parliament, right? I think it's we've lost the policy, we've lost the principles, and it's all about the process. Oh, can I get on a parliamentary list? Am I a member of some amorphous caucus that I don't know what it stands for, but maybe that's an opportunity to network and advance. Now, I'm enormously cheerful. I think the fact we're in opposition and the fact that we have proper state-enforced socialism, and we're suffering under the yoke for the first time, really, in 45 years, is going to be an enormous recruiting sergeant to the Conservative Party for lovers of liberty. And so I am optimistic that we can easily put this horror show back in its box. People like Charlie and I, but our leader, Kemi, I saw often, in the quiet opposition, to proposals that were coming out of number 10s of various flavours, genuinely standing up for first principle conservatism, and the fact that our economy is going to be in an absolute, devastated mess with rising youth unemployment, a complete absence of growth, a decline in GDP per capita, again, is going to force the political class to get serious quickly, right? You don't mess around with yogurt bans, if the economy is literally bleeding out on the floor. So I'm sort of optimistic, but we are right to be having this conversation. And maybe we should have this conversation on the main stage as well. And I certainly think, there's a program of outreach and education to make sure that, at least people understand the trade-offs. I mean, I think too many often people just get suckered into these things.
Charlie, what's your view? As you were just elected last year for the first time, you're one of the new intake. What's your take on the general direction of the sort of the party from a parliamentary perspective and more broadly going in a pro-liberty direction?
Well, look, I think we're on the right path for the moment. As Andrew says, we're not going to win the next election by promising to, disband the football regulator and bring back plastic straws, right? But it should underpin everything that we do propose. Freedom of the individual is everything, isn't it? It's lower taxes, giving people more money to choose how they spend it. It's about freeing up businesses so business owners can make their own choices about what they're doing. And it's us, returning the control of the state back to the people. Now, that can be across all policy areas. So that's really the direction that has to underpin everything we do between now and whenever the next election is. And I think also, just to say, that's clear blue water between us and Reform as well, because I think they are much more statist much more left-wing on some of their economy policies. So we need to make that very clear to people as well.
And look, I mean, most of the use cases that we talk about are not going to be retail, but clearly you go into something like mandatory ID cards, and that is capable of properly setting the world on fire in terms of our inboxes blowing up with that, people feeling who aren't engaged in the political process, feeling that this is something that is a proper rallying cry. I don't know what your experience is like, but in my experience, it's running like 97%. Against, and then when the 3% who think it is a magic silver bullet for stopping illegal immigration are confronted with some of the imperfections of the scheme, then they switch over as well. So that, there are things the government will do that are very visible encroachments on our liberty that are capable of being a more popular position.
Chris, when we look at the policies that you listed off earlier that have been enacted over the past 15 years and are still being enacted, and most importantly, the effect of those policies and whether they are working, and often they're not, I'm sure you can give us some good examples of where they're not working, is there a world in which you see the impact of these things going so badly that there might actually start to be a bit of a backlash? For example, like the generational smoking ban.
Well, firstly, that list I gave wasn't actually everything settled over the 14 years. They're just the policies that have been enacted since Labour won the election, which were in the pipeline from the Conservative Party. It's a much longer list of all the other things the government did, the sugar tax, plain packaging, and so on. I'm always personally hoping for a public backlash. But as I say, a lot of these things are not very high salience really for anybody. The only people who really benefit from these policies are their campaign groups who are being paid to campaign and therefore need a constant stream of incremental prohibitions, which when combined together, they do have a meaningful effect on people's wallets and their liberties, but individually they seem relatively trivial. I think the two things where I could see a backlash, I mean, you saw a bit of it. I mentioned Twitter before, and people couldn't. A lot of the time, people don't realise these things are coming in until they come in. And then you go to Nando's and you can't get a free refill of Coke. You go, what kind of country am I living in? And people go, oh, bloody Labour. But actually, it really was the Tories. And incidentally, you mentioned you don't bring in yogurt bans during a time of crisis. Well, actually, that policy was brought in during COVID, at the height of COVID, July 2020, when Boris Johnson, for whatever reason, whether it's because he felt he nearly died because he was fat or he just wanted some policy to distract from the poor handling of COVID. Either way, they found time to introduce a whole load of stuff on tasty food during a genuine public health crisis and a genuine economic crisis. No, the two, I would say, I think have the biggest chance of creating a backlash once they're introduced and people realise what's going on. You mentioned the generational tobacco ban. I genuinely think that a lot of people don't understand what it is. And a lot of people won't still have heard of it. But I think when Rishi Sunak and then Wes Streeting talked about we're not ever going to allow 15-year-olds to smoke, they just think, oh, we're going to ban 15-year-olds from smoking. I kind of thought we'd already done that. But when on January the 1st, 2027, the first 18-year-olds are not allowed to smoke, and they're never allowed to smoke or never allowed to buy legal tobacco, to be more precise, people, I think, are going to go, what the hell is this policy? The other thing is the vape tax, which has had very little media attention. But, £2.60 plus VAT tax on a bottle of vapes. This is the largest size bottle, thanks to the EU. 10 mils. These are £2 to £3. The tax is going to be about £3. It's going to double the price of vaping at a time when the de facto price of a pack of cigarettes, thanks to the massive illicit trade, is £5. So the economic incentive to switch from smoking to vaping is going to largely disappear. And I don't think people realise that that's in the pipeline. And for a lot of vapers, when they go into the shop on October the 1st next year, that potentially has a backlash. But then it's kind of too late. It's unlikely, given the situation Rachel Reeves finds herself with the public finances, that she's going to be repealing any taxes. People are just going to have to lump it, I'm afraid.
That brings us on to an interesting point about the scale of our current fiscal crisis, the scale of the national debt is over 100 million. We pay more servicing that debt than we pay on the police and defence combined. When you're standing on your manifesto in 2029 or whenever it comes, will these taxes that will raise some money, probably not a lot of money, probably not as much money as they hope, but there will be some money raised from these sorts of measures. Will they be top of the list of things to cut, or will you be looking elsewhere?
Look, I strongly doubt they will be top of the list of things to cut. I mean, there's just an inertia in the system, and we see that with every single tax ever invented since income tax, which was, of course, a temporary measure for a wartime emergency, and seems to still be the Napoleonic Wars still seem to be with us. So being completely honest, is in somebody crafting, for the same reasons we talked about, in somebody crafting a set of, manifestos, a retail manifestation of policies, are they going to say we're going to, spend in government terms £250 million a year repealing the sugar tax rather than cutting stamp duty, inheritance tax, things that have a broader reach? Probably not. What we're playing for, I think, with the heart and soul of the Conservative Party, is to avoid any further encroachments on our liberty. There may be scope, I think, in some really sensible pushing back and rolling back. There may not be in this domain, there might be. But if you look to other infringements on personal freedom, think about alcohol licensing. I mean, it's so hard. The nighttime economy in our cities is being suppressed. There's vast parts of London where you can't get a drink after 10:30 at night. Nightclubs are forced to shut at 1 a.m., and you can see a proper, flip side to that of saying that this is not only prohibitionist in nature, but it's also genuinely undermining the economy. It's quite possible the football regulator will be very high up as a candidate for repeal, if only because it won't have grown to the excesses that every other regulator does. Told my lifetime, every regulator ever set up never solves the problem it was set up to cure. All it does is find new ones that justify giving it even more resources. And we're very publicly committed to reducing the number and the size, and in some cases, the scope of regulators. So your football governance one might well be a promising casualty. And then just a final point, because this is a conference, we're having a policy debate. You're all brilliant, bright young people here. We're hungry for ideas of where we can do this. The key difference for the next government has to be a plan, because it's the lack of a plan that blows this stuff off course, right? I mean, if you have if we'd got a plan for that last, was it 15 months of office when Rishi was in? I mean, if he'd literally come in and said, right, well, it ain't looking good, boys and girls, we may not yet win the next election, but we've got a wonderful programme of reform while we've got a majority, while we are the party of government. We're going to appoint the right people to quangos. We're going to do what we can in government to roll back the size of the state. You wouldn't have ended up with that Sunday afternoon, King's Speech scout around of, look, hey, Perkins, has anyone got a good idea? It's looking a bit thin. Oh, what about that long-buried, smoking thing that Jacinda Ardern did?
All those people coaxing cats down the pavement.
Exactly. So having a plan is a really, really good antidote to any organisation being taken adrift and pursuing more ephemeral agendas.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is we can talk about reducing the size of the state, but ultimately that is going to be presented by our opponents as cutting spending. And the areas where we're going to have to cut spending is obviously going to be significant. And if we're going to look significant cuts, those are departments that are difficult. You're looking work and pensions, you're looking Department of Health. Immediately, you've got a political issue there because we'll be, accused of trying to sell off the NHS, etc., etc. We'll be difficult one on pensions, obviously, given, our support amongst the older residents of this country. So we are going to have to make sure that we sell this in order to be electable, because it's very easy to attack spending cuts, and our opponents will do it. We've seen that time and time again. Now, of course, events may overtake us because the state of the economy as it stands is not good. And if we end up with a fiscal event and an economic crisis similar to, say, 2008, that may provide us with more room for manoeuvre, because we have to sell this idea, as Kemi has repeatedly said, that we are not living within our means. And that is not an easy sell, because I think particularly post-COVID, where I think we saw some people were drunk on the state spending, and it seemed like the state could answer all of our problems. We can all sit at home and not go to work. We have to persuade the great British public that we cannot go on as we are.
Yes, we framed a lot of this. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's on the mention of the phrase "the size of the state." I always think there's two ways of looking at the size of the state, but we generally measure it as how much GDP the government is spending, and that's a legitimate thing to do. But so much of government spending are cash transfers now. I don't really consider, the pension bill as being a meaningful measure of the size of the state. I think that there's another way of looking at the size of the state, and that's just how oppressive the state feels to you on a day-to-day basis. A.J.P. Taylor, in his tremendous book about the Britain between the wars, starts off by saying until August 1914, a normal individual could go through life barely barely encountering the state, aside from seeing the postman or occasionally having to go in and pay your taxes or something like that. Of course, society has changed enormously since then, but I think just the general sense that, I have to carry an ID card, or I can't vape outside. These are the things I think that actually people feel the state is too big, when you just feel the state over your shoulder all the time. And that's something that you can relieve that burden. You can repeal those laws without costing anything.
It's that the line you used earlier, is this, what sort of country am I living in when I can't do all those things, is where that pinch starts to be felt. I want to talk a little bit about the economic impact, because we framed a lot of this discussion in terms of sort of individual liberty and very sound hierarchy and classical liberal ideals that we all here feel, but maybe not everybody does. But potentially one of the ways to persuade the nation of the need for these policies is the beneficial economic impact that would possibly be felt by repealing them. Chris, could you start us off with what's the impact on businesses of this overbearing nanny statism?
It depends on what the regulation is, and now and again businesses quite like these kind of regulations, and there are often winners and losers with these kind of things. I think there are some large gambling companies that are quite welcome a ban on gambling advertising at the moment, for example, in the same way as in the actual fact the large tobacco companies rather benefited from restrictions on tobacco advertising back in the day. There were elements of the pub trade and indeed some alcohol manufacturers in support of minimum pricing, because let's face it, it's price collusion, essentially. If the booze companies did it voluntarily, they'd be taken to court by the Monopoly Commission, whatever they call it these days. So there are winners and losers, but generally speaking, there is usually a one-off payment to comply with the regulations. There can be cost to jobs from time to time, again, depending on what the particular law says. But yeah, I'm less bothered about the producer than the consumer. And again, you'll find sometimes that once these laws have been brought in and industry have paid the cost of compliance, they rather like keeping it that way because it keeps out some of their competitors. And in fact, it might cost them more to get rid of it again. So let's not worry too much about the producer. Let's except insofar as it affects the consumer, as Adam Smith would say. And it affects the consumer very negatively, most obviously in the case of taxes, because obviously it just makes your preferences more expensive, or more subtly, just through your general consumer well-being. A lot of the nanny state policies are designed, in the case of food reformulation, to make products worse. I mean, literally make them less tasty by taking out the salt, sugar, and fat. You've had all sorts of regulations of tobacco over the years, banning menthol cigarettes and changing the composition of things. We've seen beer being watered down, which is an indirect consequence of government taxation policies. These are the less tangible, but actually more important effects of these policies, that they just make people's life a bit worse. They make things less convenient, less enjoyable, and really that's the most important thing about life. It's just so hard to quantify. You can't put it on a spreadsheet in the same way that you can model how many deaths are supposedly going to be prevented by one of these fatuous policies.
Andrew, anything to add on
that? I mean, no, not really. I mean, it's the impact assessments are normally absolutely rubbish, so I don't think we can look to those as a particular protective mechanism. So,
excellent. Well, we will open to the floor for some questions if anybody would like to say anything or make a contribution or a question. There are microphones being handed around. Lucy, would you mind sorting microphones? Okay, hold up. Do we have our... it will help to put your thing on so you can hear what is being asked. Yes, gentleman at the back, yeah.
Cheers, thank you. My name's Alex Tiley. I work for British American Tobacco UK. so no guess what I'm going to ask you guys a question about, right? So the generational smoking ban is going to infantilize adults. It's going to introduce a complete ban on the marketing for any product that contains nicotine, so that we can't even communicate to adult smokers about less harmful alternatives. And it's going to take very broad powers so that the government, without any legislation or real consultation, can make whatever policy it wants in this area going forwards. My question is for the entire panel: would and should and will the Conservative Party commit to opposing the tobacco and vapes bill as it currently stands and repealing it when the Conservatives come back to power?
Andrew, if that's for you first, then we'll go around.
Yeah, we will oppose it. I voted against it every opportunity, as did Kemi. I can't commit to repeal it. That sounds a bit Weasley wordy, just because that policy decision hasn't been taken at the time. But clearly the logical inference is if you oppose something, then you don't want it to be on the statute book. Will there be other things at the time? I don't know. But we definitely oppose it right from the beginning. It's wrong. It's wrong for all the reasons you say.
Thanks. I mean, I'm not bound by the collective responsibility of the shadow front bench, so I would definitely support repealing it. I mean, to use unparliamentary language, the whole thing's batshit mental. It's just bonkers in a few years' time a 35-year-old will have to ask a 36-year-old to go to the off-licence to buy a packet of cigarettes. And the restriction it's putting on the wider industry. Someone who's just smoked 20 a day and only managed to get themselves off it with the invention of vapes. Has managed to sort of gradually reduce my nicotine consumption. It's sort of never quite got there, but it has made enormous difference, I think, in terms of that. So why on earth we're trying to restrict the alternative, which is meant to be more healthy as well, is also mad. But no, of course, I oppose it every step. But we have to. We'll make policy decisions in relation to repeal later, I suspect.
Personally speaking, I'm with Charlie, right? Personally, if it was up to me, then yes, it goes.
Excellent. Good to hear. Chris, anything to add?
I can't say what they're going to do, but obviously they should repeal it. By the time the next election comes around, assuming it's going to be in 2029, we'll be onto the 20-year-olds will not be able to buy any form of tobacco or Rizla, which may end up getting more resistance from students than the tobacco, because by no means all Rizla consumers are tobacco users. So enough people will have realised the absurdity of it by then. That who knows, we might see a backlash, and it could actually be a vote winner to repeal it.
Gentlemen here in the front, and then we'll come back.
Hello, panel. My name's Howard Jenkins. I'm a chartered surveyor. The word growth was used by Andrew earlier. It's the first time I've heard it used at this conference. The government is telling us about growth. They clearly have no understanding what growth is. I've been in business for myself for 42 years. I've had to sack people. I've had to make sacrifices. I've experienced high profits as well. So I know about growth, and I know the converse of growth. Anything to get rid of nanny statism will save money, leave money in people's pockets to spend. It seems to be in the same way that slashing the size of the civil service, who don't do as they're told, is another very good way of leaving money in people's pockets so they can spend it to encourage growth. Do you agree with me?
The same order, Andrew, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you for being in business. It's not easy. It's never easy. Certainly not easy against the headwinds of this government. Growth is the absolute imperative of the next general election. I think that's how we win. The Conservative Party putting forward a credible set of plans that are going to get the country growing again. Fewer civil servants, paring back regulation. In my domain, being on the side of entrepreneurs, coming up with more friendly tax systems, getting people in business, supporting them, making it easier to hire people through repealing Labour's unemployment regulations, and on and on and on. But that is actually Shadow Business Secretary. That's my passion project. And where it intersects is that there are all of these impedances, particularly in advertising. Advertising, if people are consenting adults, the product is a legal product, just sweep away all of that. I mean, a lot of them are ineffective. I mean, we haven't talked about black market, but all of these prohibitions to a greater or lesser degree, maybe not so much in yogurt, but who knows, there may be a yogurt smuggling ring going forward. But all of these create a black market, a grey market that not only steals tax revenues, but it's also effectively fueling criminality, and that's another form of tax on all of us in society. So there is an economic cost Sometimes it's not easy to surface, but if we can remove that, that would be good. Thank you for your...
Chris, could you just speak to us a little bit more on the black market, on the black market impact? You've done some interesting work recently, but also throughout your career on the impact of that. So if you could speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, the government has its head in its hands about the size of the tobacco black market in particular. It's lost £2 billion in tobacco duty revenue in the last 3 or 4 years, despite massively increasing the tax rate. The tax rate on hand rolling tobacco has gone up, I think, 73% since 2021. Manufactured cigarettes gone up 37%, I think. And in that time, and we're only talking 3 years, 2021 to 2024, sales of tobacco, whether hand-rolled or manufactured, have fallen by well over 40%. Now, if the smoking rate had fallen by 40%, you'd say, well, fair enough, the tax is doing its job, but it hasn't. It's fallen by maybe 9%, something like that. It's very obvious where that shortfall is going. There is no other explanation for it, other than the black market has massively increased. You can see it if you pay attention to the cigarette packs on the street or in beer gardens. It's very, very obvious what's going on, and we can see the kind of shops from which they're being sold. So the Treasury seems to, I think, have become much more ideological about this, because traditionally the Treasury has been pretty cynical and they'll support tax rises on public health grounds, but only to the point where you hit somewhere around the top of the Laffer curve. And in the last few years, it seems to be quite happy to be losing money, not because people are not smoking, but because people are switching to the black market. Similarly with wines and spirits, very big rise in wine and spirit duty, about 15% over the course of the last couple of years. And the revenue from wines and spirits has gone down. You know, there are more and more real-world examples of the Laffer curve in action. And in fact, very many of Rachel Reeves' tax policies, and we'll probably see this more next month with the budget, she seems to have come into office thinking that there are £1 billion notes lying on the pavement, and the Tories never pick them up because the Tories are on the side of the rich and the corporations and so on. And I'm afraid the reality is the Tories taxed everybody about as much as they could do. And if they weren't taxing non-doms and private schools, there's probably quite a good reason for that.
Charlie, anything to add on the growth aspect?
Yeah, I think on the growth. At the end of the day, we've got a Labour government that thinks it can legislate its way to growth. And 99 times out of 100, legislation is probably not going to lead to growth. And what we need to do as a Conservative Party is do the best for business and get the hell out of the way of business, and free business individuals and larger businesses to do what they need to do in order to maximise their profits, employ more people, and ultimately then pay more tax as a result. So,
yeah. Gentleman at the back there, please.
Thanks, panel. My name's Ryan. I'm from Bridlington, which Charlie knows very well. I think we've got into a really bad habit in a country where since COVID, we expect more and more of everybody to do something. I used to be a teacher, and it was sort of seen as an extension. Parents were using it for like extra services. For example, like bullying at home on Snapchat and TikTok and social media is an issue. Well, they're expecting me to do something about it. And I used to say, who pays the phone bill? You as a parent, so you need to deal with it. So I think a lot of parents just expect us to do more and more in the profession. But I think what we should do is, ahead of the next election, when we've got some more policies, is just be really explicit. For example, from day one, a Conservative government would do X. On the first month, we would be doing this, or by the first year, we would have gotten rid of these regulations. And I think we just lay it out, and both national and local government as well, if you're running for council, I think we'd just be explicit with the public of exactly what we would do from day one, month one, year one.
I think there's two quite interesting points in there. One about individual responsibility, and then another about how the party should be approaching it. Charlie, would you like to address one or both of those?
of course, as a voter of mine, I agree with Ryan. Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely. COVID had some unintended policies in response to COVID had unintended consequences that have carried on way beyond, I think, what any government would have expected. I think you're absolutely right, and that sort of reliance on the state that it created at the time still hasn't gone away in many instances, and that is a sort of real long-term problem that we need to wean people off. And you're absolutely right. I think we do, to be a credible alternative going into the next election, we do have to lay out that plan and make it clear. It's what any incoming government should be prepared to do. The previous government, of course, famously employed Sue Gray with the sole job of planning the first 100 days, and she forgot to get round to doing that, which is why we are in the mess we're probably in now. So we need to learn from that mistake and make sure we're on it from day one.
Yes, clear plan. I think it's as important as to what we won't do. Right, politicians are very good at saying what they will do. There's, every problem needs a new piece of legislation. Every King's Speech has more promises to legislate than the preceding one. It'd be quite good if politicians promised not to do some things as well, but they're not being too glib. I mean, the main point is you're right. If you've got a clear plan, it also means that you can drive adherence from those that may be less ideologically committed, but are probably in practice happy to follow along whatever the leader's doing. It was quite instructive when we had the tobacco and vapes bill. There were people who voted for it when the previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was for it, and then you had the same Conservative members of Parliament who, when Kemi Badenoch voted against it, they suddenly found themselves in the against lobby. So, if there are people who are of such little principle, let's make that an asset. Let's be very clear up front what we're doing, and then they've got nowhere to hide.
Chris?
I don't think I'm alone in saying that I would be very happy for the next government, whichever party it is, to have a platform that is entirely about repealing legislation and doesn't propose a single law. I don't think we need any more laws in this country. If something very new suddenly arrives that needs regulating, fine. But I think we are drowning in legislation. People are talking a lot at the moment, of course, about leaving the ECHR, and I think that's the right thing to do. But there's all sorts of other pieces of legislation that should either be repealed wholesale, like the Equality Act and the Climate Change Act, or at least have various clauses taken out. And there's two reasons for that. One is that this massive regulation is putting an enormous cost on businesses, or in the area that we're talking about today, on individuals, but also that we have quite obviously more and more judicial activism going on, which is happening as a result of well-meaning but poorly drafted legislation, which at the very least needs to be more clearly drafted and in many cases can just be repealed altogether. So I hope that over the course of the next few years, the Conservative Party will be just compiling a list of laws and parts of laws to be simply thrown out. And I think a lot of people will be very happy with that.
I am. I've got a red tape researcher doing precisely that purpose.
Fantastic.
Ideas on a face.
Excellent. We had a question over here on the right hand side.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lucy. Lucy Kay. I work for Open Seas, a promoting sustainable use of the marine environment. So I hesitate a little to put up my hand, but I've done it. I appreciate the points about nanny statism and overreach. I think in cases where, for example, in fisheries, poor management can lead to significant problems for business, through overfishing, for example. What is the role of the state in a positive sense? Where should the state be stepping in? Where should we be seeing a more active pursuit of the laws that we do already have in terms of implementing them? What loopholes do we need to close?
Fantastic question. Thank you very much, Lucy. Chris, would you like to start there?
Yeah, I mean, the relatively straightforward economist answer is market failure. If there is a market failure, then there is a case for regulation, so long as you're not going to get even more government failure, which is often, of course, the risk. The question then is, what is a market failure? And A-level economics students these days are taught that virtually everything is a market failure, including people just doing things that you don't approve of. That's not a market failure. That's the market working to allow people to pursue their own tastes and preferences. Something like, fishing is a very good example of the tragedy of the commons, right? It's a classic example of a market failure where you need the government to interact if you can't get people doing so on a voluntary basis. So, I mean, obviously this is a concept that needs fleshing out in each individual case. But my basic argument would be you need evidence of a market failure, the main ones of which are monopoly, information asymmetry, which is just a fancy way of saying consumer ignorance. Sometimes people do need to be informed about what they are, what they're buying, and negative externalities.
Straightforward, Andrew.
I mean, similar theoretical answer. I mean, in terms of externalities, pollution is an externality. People shouldn't be dumping their private property and trying to avoid charges for waste by dumping things in the ocean, for example. And so protection of nature is a perfectly legitimate, as long as it's science-based, perfectly legitimate role for the state. I think there's a general point about the evidence. I mean, it is sometimes the bar is too low on what is the actual theory of harm. What does that cost? What's the balance between the cost of the regulation versus the harm that's caused by that? A really good example right now we've got of something called extended producer responsibility. It's a massive, clunky piece of legislation. It's putting real costs, 1.5 billion on business. It's designed to promote greater recycling, but it has no mechanism to do that. So it turns into effectively just being a tax. You can't procure that's the outcome that you will actually get as a response. And no one really, as far as I can see, tried to find if you can get the same outcome at a lower cost. So that's a good example of in my view, a bad regulation. It's one that if I can make the case to repeal that, I will do, because it's a burden on business, but it's not delivering the outcome we want.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. As the proud member of Parliament for the lobster capital of Europe, it's a really, really important issue in my constituency. And none of the trawlermen in Bridlington want to overfish that water because, of course, their businesses are reliant on it being sustainable. So you're right, we do have to obviously put measures in place to stop a malign, foreign influence perhaps coming at overfishing an area. Of course, we need to do that. But we also need to, and to Andrew's point around water quality, which of course would be science-based, because the better the water quality, the better the fish stocks. Again, there is a role there for government and its agencies. But it's a sort of wider point about where we can draw back from for overreach regulation. Of course, we should, but there will always be a role for things like that, particularly around fisheries.
So thank you for a great question. Any more questions from the room? Yes, on here. So we'll come to Officer.
Hello. I've heard others make what they would say was a conservative case for nanny statism, which is that nanny statism can be preventative, that prevention is cheaper than cure, and that nanny statism can therefore reduce the future liabilities facing the state and therefore can ensure that taxes are lower than they otherwise might be. And I wondered if you accepted that there can sometimes be a trade-off between Chris's helpful distinction between the size of the state in terms of how oppressive it is and the size of the state in terms of how high taxes are. And if so, which should the Conservative Party focus on reducing?
More great questions. Just as an addendum to that, in our previous discussion, it was mentioned that George Osborne has recently said that his proudest achievement from being in government was the sugar tax. So there are these Tories out there who want to sort of do this willingly and passionately, rather than just because they don't have a backbone to necessarily stop it. Let's start, Chris. We'll work our way down.
Well, people like to have a legacy, don't they? Just on your point there. Rishi Sunak introduced this ridiculous generational ban partly because he just has this sort of Californian hatred of smoking, but because he wanted a legacy, and he remembers Tony Blair having the legacy of the indoor smoking ban. Sorry, Callum, what was the question?
And it
was about the cost of the NHS. Yes, sorry. No, I reject this argument on two grounds. Firstly, insofar as people smoking or being obese is an externality because of the cost of the NHS, it's what I would call an induced externality. It's not a natural externality. We're being forced to pay for each other's healthcare. We go along with that. It seems rather unfair having forced people to socialise their healthcare costs to then say, oh, but you also now have to live in this particular way. Otherwise, you're costing other people money. I mean, the nature of the system is that some people will cost more than others, and you just accept that. But perhaps the more important point is that, just as a simple matter of economics, it's not true that smokers will take less from the welfare state, and indeed even the NHS, than non-smokers, simply because they're not around for as long on average as non-smokers. And the same seems to be true of obese people. That is less true of alcohol, partly because alcohol kills far fewer people, but also because the people it does tend to kill tend to be of working age, and so there is a lost output element to it. But the sensible way to deal with that is by having a Pigovian tax, which is what we do. The taxes that we have on alcohol far exceed any conceivable cost to the state, whether it through the criminal justice system or the healthcare system. So it's actually a very dangerous argument for nanny status to use, because the reality is, if you're all about making the state as efficient as possible, you would be subsidising cigarettes and sugary drinks.
Yeah, I mean, intellectually, I mean, obviously, we all buy in. I think we probably all buy into the idea of prevention being less costly when it comes to defence. You'd probably make that same argument on things like speeding, road traffic regulations. So, I don't think we're not entirely rejecting that argument. The challenge, I agree, is you've got, and it's the Hayekian thing, which is like, there's a point at which the state is so significant as an economic force that it uses that as an overreach to then reach into your personal life. I mean, I'm not against the NHS, don't get me wrong, but as an intellectual construct, if there wasn't a nationalised health system, there wouldn't be a need for a national obesity strategy, because there wouldn't be a whole class of people who think that that's somehow within their domain because it's a cost and it's something to be managed within that system. So the more the role of the economic state, the more it will license itself to infringe on individual freedom and liberty. So I reject that.
Yeah, it sort of comes down to the simple argument: does the state know better than you do? And that's if that's your viewpoint, then of course the state, will go full communist, and you'll be told exactly what you do with all your money. At the end of the day, I think as Conservatives, we believe that the individual knows best, that we know how best to spend our money and to look after our affairs. Of course, there's always a role for the state in certain areas, but we believe that really that should be limited to anywhere it's needed.
Excellent. We've got a few hands up, but there was a gentleman here. If you would like to ask another question, one here.
So it's somewhat of an odd question, but where do you think we should draw the line between individual choice and, being an actual Conservative party? In terms of, there used to be a point in this country, for example, where pornography was banned, and some people, more so in the United States, but I've spoken to people here, they think that sort of thing probably shouldn't have happened, and it is the state's role to sort of make sure that society is a moral. Morality is upheld. So where do we draw the line, and where would you draw the line? Where should the Conservative Party draw the line?
Fantastic, thank you. We'll go reverse, Charlie.
Well, I think it's really the sort of the rule of law here, isn't it? It's if something is illegal and for good reason illegal, then that is where obviously we should be preventing access to certain things. So obviously, you take the case of pornography. Obviously, there's all sorts of stuff out there in the dark web and everything else that we are aware of that obviously people shouldn't have access to. But again, if something is legal and there is no harm to people from it, the state doesn't really have a role in stopping people do that. So it's a balance, of course. We just have to balance that between legality, illegality, safety of the individual as well, and make sure that the government isn't over-regulated to prevent people from doing things that are pretty harmless. So.
Yeah, look, I mean, it is, forgive me, it is the eternal piece of string question, and I hope that each of us would have a slightly different position and where the exact line would be drawn, and then we use a parliamentary democratic mechanism to resolve that and agree essentially what the lines of legal and non-legal are. I also observe it just changes over time. And that, again, is why it's important that these are democratic decisions, not devolved to some quango, and that there's a regular opportunity for people to revisit those. But I think one of the uniting Conservative beliefs is, as Charlie say, belief in the sovereignty of the individual, a general distrust of the state, and the fact that the state should be our servant, not our master. And that's the high-level principle. You'll apply it to each individual case. I'm not a libertarian. I think there is a role for the state, but you have to find that in the right way of determining it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious that this is the Conservative Party. It's not the Libertarian Party or the Liberal Party, and the Conservative Party is a broad church, and far be it from me to, tell you who to allow in. When I gave the examples of Sarah Wollaston and Rory Stewart, who went off and, in the case of Sarah Wollaston, literally joined the Change UK and then the Lib Dems, and Rory Stewart, who now says he would vote Green, I think, it seems fairly obvious these people didn't have anything that approaches conservative values, except that conservative values are something of a movable feast. All I would say is that, throughout history, certainly since the war, the Conservative Party has always done better when it leant towards liberalism. And in the case of Thatcher and Churchill, had leaders who were basically liberals. And it's done better during those times than when it's had people like Ted Heath and Theresa May. And I think that's true economically. When the Tory party has embraced free markets, of course, the country has done better economically, but I think it's done better socially as well.
Of course. Gentlemen at the back here, if we keep them short, we are running out of time. That'll be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My questions are going to be around the regulation of football. So I'm a free marketeer. I believe, generally speaking, that businesses should survive or fall based on their own merits in the market forces. In regards to football, though, I think it is a different case. If I don't like something I'm buying in Tesco, or go to Sainsbury's or go somewhere else, as a football supporter, and I'm a third-generation Liverpool supporter, I'm not just going to go, oh, I'll go support Arsenal tomorrow, because you've got that emotional investment in your team. So with that in mind, do you think there is any role for the state in terms of securing these clubs, which are so important to individuals and to communities, from being run down potentially by businessmen without the best interest of the community at heart?
Excellent question. We will forgive your Liverpool fanship. That's fine. Chris, would you like to start us off?
I just think there's a very big risk that the football regulator will do much more harm than good, for the reasons that Charlie's already explained. There is bound to be a mission creep, just like you got with, for example, the Food Standards Agency, which started off with a tiny little staff and it inspected the odd dodgy restaurant because there were reports of rats crawling around, and now goes out and it's vastly expanded and gets involved in all sorts of things, including nanny state lobbying. How many football clubs have actually gone bust in the last 50 years or so? Very, very few. Morecambe was supposed to go bust a few months ago, but as nearly always happens, someone came in and bought the club. The risk I see is that very, very quickly the football regulator will, for example, be saying you need to have X number of women on the board, you need to control the ticket prices. The government, both the previous government and this government, have promoted this on the basis that fans will be kind of in charge, and they'll be in charge of how much the club spends and how much the ticket prices are. Well, this is not going to work, because fans always want to spend a lot of money and they always want to keep the ticket prices down. This is a recipe for more clubs rather than fewer clubs going bust, I would argue.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just not met the threshold for state intervention that I would apply. I mean, I respect your choice. It is a choice. You said yourself it was an emotional choice. So you feel emotionally vested in this. I feel emotionally invested in lots of ideas, including, my autonomy over myself as an individual. But, with great respect, it's not life-saving treatment. It's not the bread that keeps you alive. And exactly as Chris said, there will be, even if it was going to be the most wonderful, benighted, benevolent regulator, I have to be completely honest and consistent and say I'd still be against it. That is not my experience of regulators. You do get constant mission creep. They're not going to sit down and go home. You've already got different parts of the football establishment arguing for quite redistributive approaches that won't be to Liverpool's advantage, and on and on. So I have to be honest. Conservatives shouldn't always seek to be popular. Sometimes we have to tell the hard truths.
But I would have to say, as a Leeds fan, I should be in favour of the football regulator. I mean, Ken Bates, Cellino, Golf Capital Holdings, we've had them all in charge of the club. But at the end of the day, there already is a football regulator. It's called the Football Association. And if the Football Association has lost its way and needs to sort itself out, they are the ones responsible for the fit and proper persons test. That clearly hasn't worked. It doesn't need the government and some Labour donor to come in as a regulator to sort this whole thing out. They need to sort out their own house.
Fantastic. I'm afraid that is probably all we've got time for with the questions. I'd like to thank my panel for joining us, and thank you two for coming. And do make sure that to find everything out from the IEA, all of our output, all of our podcast, blogs, events, etc., follow us on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.